At 3:12 in the morning, traffic cameras near Bandar Abbas caught the same strange thing on 6 different roads, headlights racing toward bridges that were no longer there. In less than 2 minutes, key crossings linking Iran's southern coast to its interior were ripped apart by precision strikes. That did not just break concrete, it threatened the flow of fuel, missiles, food, and men through one of the most important military corridors in the Middle East. What happened next was not just another raid. It was the moment this war changed shape. The first shock was not the explosions themselves. It was the silence that followed. No long air raid sirens, no public warning, no dramatic buildup, just dark roads, burning spans, and commanders trying to understand whether this was a message or the start of something bigger. By sunrise, smoke still hung over the coastal highways. Drivers were turning around in long lines, military convoys were stalled, and emergency crews were trying to reach crossing points that had become piles of broken steel. For ordinary people, it looked like chaos. For planners in Washington, it looked like design. Because bridges are not random targets. They are choices. When a military stops hitting barracks and radar sites and starts hitting transport links, it is no longer trying only to destroy weapons. It is trying to choke the system that keeps the weapons alive. That is what made this night different. A missile launcher can be replaced, a warehouse can be moved, even a command post can be rebuilt in another building. But when a bridge falls in the right place, everything behind it slows down, bunches up, and becomes easier to track. To understand why that matters, the story has to start with geography. Southern Iran is not a flat open map where traffic can scatter in every direction. It is a narrow and difficult zone where roads, tunnels, rail lines, and pipelines are shaped by coastlines, rivers, hills, and mountain edges. Bandar Abbas sits at the center of that geography, like a hinge. It is not just a port city. It is the main southern gate through which military cargo, fuel, spare parts, and naval support can move toward the Strait of Hormuz and back into the interior. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the tightest and most dangerous choke points on Earth. A huge share of the world's oil trade passes through that narrow stretch of water. Every tanker delay, every mine warning, every missile launch near those lanes sends fear through world markets within hours. That is why every road around Bandar Abbas carries more meaning than it seems to. A bridge there is not only a piece of transport infrastructure. It can become a pressure point in a global energy war. It can shape what reaches the coast, what leaves the coast, and what never arrives at all. For months, the conflict had been building toward a moment like this. Early strikes focused on air defenses, command centers, missile storage, drone depots, and radar sites. Those attacks were about blinding and weakening. They were violent, but they still fit the old logic of targeting military power directly. Then came the second phase. This time, the question was no longer whether Iran could be hurt. That had already been answered. The question was whether Iran could be slowed, squeezed, and forced to fight under worse conditions than before. The reason was simple. Tehran's ability to pressure the strait did not depend on one bunker or one base. It depended on movement. Boats needed fuel, launchers needed reloads, radar teams needed generators, drone units needed parts and fresh crews. Everything had to keep moving. That is why roads mattered. That is why rail mattered. And that is why the bridges became the story. Whoever chose those targets understood that supply is often more important than firepower. A missile that never reaches the coast is as useless as one that never existed. In the days before the strikes, there were hints that something had shifted. Commercial satellite images showed unusual traffic near naval staging areas. Tankers were hesitating. Insurance rates for shipping were climbing. American officials were warning that freedom of navigation could not be negotiated forever. At the same time, Iran was signaling the opposite. Small, fast boats were dispersing to secondary anchor points. Coastal missile units were reportedly changing location more often. Public statements from Tehran carried the same message again and again, that any outside pressure in the strait would be answered. That created a dangerous clock. Every day the shipping lanes stayed under threat. The pressure on Washington and its allies grew. Oil traders watched. Gulf states watched. Commanders watched. And somewhere inside planning rooms, the bridge option moved from idea to order. But here is what nobody expected. The first effects were not on warships. They were on trucks, ambulances, repair teams, and civilians trying to understand why the normal roads had vanished overnight. That is the thing about infrastructure war. It reaches the front line through the back door. Witnesses near one of the damaged crossings described a blast so precise it seemed unreal. The road surface did not explode everywhere. A support section failed, the center span dropped, and the whole bridge folded into darkness. Cars behind it slammed on brakes only meters from the edge. At another crossing west of the port, a rail bridge was reportedly hit near a junction that fed cargo inland. That mattered for a different reason. Heavy equipment is easier to move by rail than by road. Ammunition, fuel bladders, engineering parts, and bulk cargo depend on those routes. Military planners have a term for this kind of strategy. They call it interdiction. The word sounds cold, but the idea is simple. Do not fight every unit at the front if you can cut the flow behind it. Make the enemy weaker before the next battle even starts. And yet interdiction only works if the target network is tight enough. Iran is not blind to its own geography. It has spent years building alternate routes, bypass roads, tunnel links, and layered coastal positions, precisely because it knows the South can become vulnerable under heavy strike pressure. So the goal was probably never total paralysis in one night. That would be too neat, too simple, too clean for real war. The goal was more likely delay, confusion, rerouting, and forced concentration. Slow the flow, narrow the options, and create predictable patterns that can be hit again. That is what turns one strike into a campaign. A broken bridge is not only damage, it is a future trap. Traffic piles onto secondary roads. Repair crews rush in, communications spike, military escorts reveal priorities. A country under pressure starts showing which assets matter most. By midday, that pattern was already taking shape. Local crews were trying to inspect damaged routes while traffic was diverted around urban bottlenecks. Reports suggested that some military vehicles were being redirected through older inland roads that were slower, narrower, and easier to monitor from the air. Meanwhile, the strikes did not stop at concrete. Communications nodes near the coast were also reportedly hit. Towers, relay sites, and signal infrastructure matter because movement without coordination creates its own kind of paralysis. Trucks can still drive, but not where they are most needed or not in time. That pairing was the real clue. Physical isolation on the ground, informational isolation in the network. Cut the roads and blur the signals, and even units that survive can become less useful. A launch team with fuel but no targeting update is delayed. A boat with orders but no spare parts is stranded. This was no longer just a hunt for military hardware. It looked like an attempt to shape behavior across an entire operational zone. Not to flatten cities, not to occupy ground, but to make the southern war machine slower, hungrier, and easier to disrupt over days and weeks. And that raises the first hard question. Was the goal to stop attacks in the Strait of Hormuz, or to build bargaining leverage by making the cost of continued resistance harder for Tehran to ignore? In modern war, those two aims often travel together, and that is what makes them hard to separate. The human side of that question is where the script turns dark. Bridges do not carry only military traffic. They carry workers, families, food deliveries, water tankers, and buses. Even the most precise strike on a transport link spreads fear far beyond the battlefield. A father driving medicine north does not care what military theory sits behind the blast site. A repair worker staring at a collapsed span does not see interdiction doctrine. He sees risk, delay, and the possibility that the next strike comes while the bridge is still burning. That is the cruel math of infrastructure attacks. They can be militarily rational and still socially brutal. They can be aimed at supply chains and still shake homes, hospitals, and markets. And once that line is crossed, every later target becomes easier to argue for. If bridges can be justified because they feed the coast, then rail yards can be justified too. If rail yards can be justified, then fuel depots move up the list, then pumping stations, then electrical substations. Then the war stops talking only about weapons and starts talking about systems. That is why this night mattered more than the damage count alone. It was a signal about what kind of war this had become. Not a short burst of punishment, but a contest over endurance, movement, and daily function. The center of gravity had shifted from destruction to pressure. In Tehran, that shift would have been understood immediately. Iranian planners have long believed that outside powers prefer quick wins, clean headlines, and limited risk. A campaign against bridges says something else. It says patience. It says repetition. It says this may last longer than anyone hoped. For commanders on the coast, the problem was immediate. Which routes were still open? Which launch teams had enough fuel? Which depots could still be reached before sunrise the next day? Which assets were now cut off from fast reinforcement? And most dangerous of all, which choke points would be struck next? Because once the pattern is seen, every road becomes suspicious. Every tunnel entrance feels exposed. Every traffic jam becomes a target risk. That kind of fear changes decision-making fast. Units start moving at odd hours. Cargo moves in smaller loads. Repair becomes rushed. Mistakes multiply. But the United States was taking a risk too. A bridge campaign can work tactically and fail strategically. If it hardens the enemy's political will faster than it degrades the enemy's logistics, then the physical damage may buy less than expected. History is full of examples like that. This is where the Strait of Hormuz returns to the center of the story. The narrow waterway does not need a full naval blockade to become dangerous. A few mines, scattered drones, mobile anti-ship missiles, and sudden harassment by fast attack craft can be enough to raise panic. That means Iran does not need perfect logistics to keep the threat alive. It needs just enough fuel to move the boats, just enough communications to cue a launch, just enough spare parts to keep a radar alive for one more night, just enough pressure to keep insurance costs high. So the bridge strikes may not have been designed to stop the threat all at once. They may have been designed to make every future Iranian move more expensive, slower, and less reliable. That is a different kind of victory, Smaller on paper, but powerful over time. There was another layer to it. Repair itself becomes intelligence. The order in which damaged crossings are restored tells outside observers what matters most. If a military route is fixed before a civilian one, that says something. If a rail link gets emergency work before a market road, that says something too. In that sense, the bombs do more than break. They ask questions. Which corridor matters more? Which unit gets priority? Which region can be left waiting? And in wartime, the answers often reveal more than speeches ever do. By the second night, secondary footage suggested emergency engineering teams had reached several points. Temporary barriers appeared, cranes were moved in, traffic was redirected where possible. State media spoke of resilience, repairs, and normal function returning soon. But urgency has its own language, and the speed of those efforts told its own story. If the damage had been meaningless, no one would rush that hard. If the routes were easy to replace, no one would fight to restore them under threat. The bridge campaign seemed to confirm the basic point, that these crossings were not decorative pieces of infrastructure. They were vital links. And then came the next twist. Additional strikes reportedly hit areas tied to maritime communications and coastal support. That widened the picture. This was not only about cutting transport, it was about reducing Iran's ability to see, react, coordinate, and sustain pressure along the sea lanes at the same time. The combination created a powerful image. The coast was not being erased, it was being tightened. Every strike closed another inch of operational freedom. Every destroyed support point pushed surviving units into a smaller and more visible box. That is how modern air power tries to win without owning the ground. Still, the biggest mystery remained unanswered. Why now? Why not keep striking missile depots and command bunkers? Why move to bridges at this moment? The answer may lie in the one thing every global capital understands: energy shock. When tankers stopped moving normally through Hormuz, the effects spread far beyond the Gulf. Prices jump. Insurance spreads widen. Shipping schedules break. Governments call emergency meetings. Traders start pricing fear rather than flow. A local military problem becomes a world problem in a matter of hours. That kind of pressure changes political patience. It narrows the window for symbolic action and increases the demand for visible effect. Blowing up a hidden bunker deep inland may matter militarily, but it does not always send a clear signal to markets or to allies waiting for reassurance. A bridge, by contrast, is visible. It is concrete proof that the war has entered a new level. It tells friends that action is being taken. It tells enemies that movement is now in the crosshairs. It tells neutrals that the cost of disruption in the Gulf is being answered. That does not make it wise. It makes it legible. And in wartime, leaders often want actions that can be understood instantly by many audiences at once. The bridge strikes fit that pattern almost perfectly. For Iranian leaders, the answer could not simply be public anger. It had to be operational adaptation. Routes had to be redrawn. Assets had to be dispersed more carefully. Some units likely shifted to lighter and less predictable transport. Others may have been held back to avoid losing them on exposed roads. That adaptation matters because Iran has spent decades preparing for a war in which fixed sites would be vulnerable. It has invested in underground storage, mobile launchers, decentralized support, and layered redundancy. A bridge campaign hurts, but it does not automatically crack a system built for pressure. In fact, there is a case that such strikes can force the enemy into a form that is harder to target. Large convoys become small ones, clear routes become fragmented ones, centralized depots become dispersed caches. What begins as disruption can sometimes create a more elusive opponent. That is why the clock matters so much. The first 24 hours after such strikes are often the most valuable. Confusion is highest then, signals are loudest then, repair plans are weakest then. If follow-on intelligence and strikes do not keep pace, the effect starts shrinking. And yet even temporary disruption can shape the next phase. A delayed fuel convoy today can mean fewer patrol boats tomorrow. A broken rail movement tonight can mean less ammunition at a coastal launcher by the weekend. War is often decided in those small and unseen timings. Around this point, the story becomes less about explosions and more about decisions made under pressure. Somewhere, likely before dawn, Iranian officers had to choose what to save first: mobility, communications, missile stocks, naval support, civil order. Every choice protected one part of the system and exposed another. That is where human psychology enters the battlefield. Systems do not panic. People do. Exhausted officers with partial information make harder choices. Political leaders demand confidence before confidence exists. Drivers refuse dangerous roads. Engineers rush repairs under the fear of a second strike. War becomes a chain of strained judgment. For American planners, there would have been a parallel tension. Strike too little and the enemy adapts. Strike too much, and the campaign begins to look like punishment rather than interdiction. Each additional target can bring military benefit and political cost at the same time. That balance is fragile. One mistaken hit on a clearly civilian crossing, one strike that severs water or medical access too visibly, one attack seen as unnecessary. and the entire narrative changes. What looked like strategy starts looking like escalation without limit. This is why infrastructure war is so dangerous. It rarely stays neat. At the beginning, the targets are explained in careful military language: choke points, throughput, routing, sustainment. But the people living beneath those words experience something simpler: fear that daily life is being turned into a pressure point. By the third day, the outside world was watching not just the battlefield, but the repair order. Which roads were reopening, which ports were slowing, which districts were losing power, which military activities near the coast appeared reduced, and which continued almost unchanged. If a war has a hidden scoreboard, that was it. Not speeches, not claims of victory, not dramatic maps on television. The real measure was whether the southern logistics web was bending faster than it could recover. There is a reason military historians study bridges so closely. They are often the clearest signs of what one side believes the next stage will require. Armies that expect a quick diplomatic reset do not usually begin cutting transport arteries. Armies preparing for an extended contest often do. That may be the most important clue in this entire story. The bridge strikes suggest that hopes for a short war had faded. Whoever approved them was preparing the battle space for a longer struggle, one measured in supply chains, repeated disruption, and cumulative fatigue. Then came the climactic insight, the one that turns the whole night into something larger. These bridges were not just links between two sides of a river, they were the landward throat of Iran's coastal war effort. Squeeze that throat, and every coastal option becomes harder to sustain. The logic is brutal, but clear. Iran can threaten shipping only if the southern machine keeps breathing. Keep the boats fueled, the launchers supplied, the coast informed, and the threat lives. Interrupt that rhythm again, and the threat may survive, but in a thinner and more fragile form. At the tactical level, that means fewer easy movements, more detours, more night driving, more fuel wasted on rerouting, more pressure on secondary roads, more dependence on temporary fixes. Every one of those details matters when a country is trying to maintain military pressure under heavy surveillance. At the strategic level, it means something even bigger. The war stops being only about destroying what Iran has. It becomes about controlling what Iran can still do tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that. That is a different kind of warfare, and often a harder one to end. But here's the part that lingers. Destroying bridges does not destroy resolve. In some wars, it weakens it. In others, it hardens it. A state that feels cornered can become less flexible, not more. Pain does not always produce surrender. Sometimes it produces deeper commitment. That is especially true when national pride, outside pressure, and historical memory mix together. Countries under visible foreign attack often tell themselves that endurance is victory. Every broken road becomes proof of sacrifice. Every repair becomes proof of resistance. That emotional layer can outlast material damage. So even if the strikes were militarily clever, they may also have guaranteed a longer emotional war. That is one reason these attacks are so consequential. They do not just damage movement, they reshape how both sides imagine the conflict. For sailors in the Gulf, the stakes were immediate. Every delay in suppressing coastal threats meant more uncertainty in the shipping lanes. Tanker crews do not think like diplomats. They think in terms of risk zones, warning distances, and whether the next horizon flash means exercise or attack. For families in southern Iran, the war suddenly moved closer to daily life. A bridge collapse is not an abstract headline. It changes commutes, deliveries, hospital routes, school transport, and access to work. The war entered ordinary motion. That is often when people feel it most sharply. For commanders in the field, the pressure became almost mathematical. How much stock remained forward? How many hours of fuel were left? Which coastal sites could still be supported? Which repairs could be done under threat? Which convoys must move now, and which could wait until dark? And above all, what if the bridges were only the beginning? That question hangs over every infrastructure campaign. If transport is now fair game, what comes next? Tunnel mouths, power transfer sites, desalination support, pumping stations, rail depots. Once the logic expands, it is hard to shrink it again. That is why this night can be seen as a hinge. Before it, the war still looked like a contest over military assets. After it, the conflict began to look like a contest over a state's ability to function normally while fighting. That is a much wider battlefield. In the resolution phase, the most important thing was not the rubble itself, but the response around it. Engineers, traffic controllers, military police, depot managers, and local officials became part of the war story. The front line had moved into logistics, and logistics is always staffed by human beings. Every repaired lane would matter. Every restored rail segment would matter. Every reopened route would be studied for what it revealed. And every delay would be noted by both sides as proof either of success or survival. There's also the regional picture. Gulf governments cannot ignore a campaign like this. They rely on stable shipping, predictable markets, and the belief that maritime disruption can be contained. When bridges near Bandar Abbas are falling, that belief starts to crack. The same is true for outside powers watching from farther away. Europe sees energy risk. Asia sees shipping risk. Financial markets see premium and fear. Even countries not directly involved have to recalculate because the Strait of Hormuz is never only a local issue. That is why a single night of bridge strikes can echo so widely. The physical destruction is local. The political signal is regional. The economic effect is global. Few targets in war combine those layers so neatly. Yet the final judgment remains difficult. If the coastal threat decreases over time, supporters of the strikes will call them necessary and precise. If Iran continues harassment and adapts around the damage, critics will say the campaign widened the war without solving the central problem. Both outcomes can even be partly true at once. Wars rarely offer clean scorecards. A bridge can be a meaningful military target and still become a symbol of dangerous escalation. A strike can succeed on paper and fail in politics. It can also fail quickly and still change the future. That is the lesson beneath the fire and concrete. The most important target was not the bridge alone. It was time. Time for tankers to move, time for convoys to arrive. Time for coastal units to operate with confidence. Time for leaders to hold their preferred pace of war. The United States tried to steal the time in one night. Not by invading, not by occupying ground, not by announcing a new doctrine in public, by making movement itself slower and more costly at the edge of the most important waterway in the region. Iran, in turn, would try to buy that time back, with repairs, with rerouting, with dispersion, with retaliation, with messaging, with whatever mixture of military adaptation and political resolve it could still command under pressure. That ongoing contest is why the broken spans matter more than they appear to. They are not only wreckage, they are the visible outline of an invisible struggle over tempo, endurance, and control of escalation. Long after the smoke clears, analysts will still ask the same questions. Which bridge mattered most? Which route was truly indispensable? Which unit was stranded? Which convoy arrived late? Which repair came first? Which response revealed the deeper weakness? But people living through the moment do not experience it that way. They experience blocked roads, longer lines, uncertain nights, and the sense that the war is no longer staying in military zones. That feeling is often more powerful than any official statement. In that sense, the attack changed the war even before its full military effect could be measured. It altered the emotional map. It told every driver, sailor, commander, and family near the southern corridor that daily movement itself had become contested ground, and once that happens, the conflict becomes harder to contain. Fear travels faster than freight. Rumor travels faster than repair. Markets react faster than diplomats. A collapsed bridge can create political aftershocks long before engineers know how quickly it can be rebuilt. The bigger picture is stark. Modern wars are increasingly fought against networks rather than only against armies. Fuel lines, ports, rails, towers, and crossings become part of the battlefield because they hold the system together. Destroy the right node and the whole web tightens. That logic may be effective. It may also be a warning for every state watching. If this is now accepted practice, then future conflicts will begin aiming at the machinery of normal life earlier and more openly than before. That should trouble everyone, because no society is as redundant as it thinks when the right links fail together. No city feels large when its key routes are cut. No military looks modern when its movement slows to detours and guesswork. The bridge campaign was a reminder of how thin resilience can become under precision pressure. And still, one unresolved mystery remains at the center of it all. Did the strikes mark the start of a campaign meant to force de-escalation, or the first move in a much longer effort to slowly squeeze the southern front until something deeper breaks? The answer may depend on what is targeted next. If future strikes stay close to direct military support, the argument for interdiction remains stronger. If the list expands into systems needed for basic civilian life, the meaning changes sharply. That is why the world will keep watching southern Iran, not only for launches and explosions, but for repairs. Repair order is policy in concrete form. It shows what a state values first when pressure is real and time is short. Watch which bridges are restored fastest. Watch which rail links get priority. Watch whether traffic patterns return or remain warped. Watch whether coastal military activity thins out or simply shifts shape. The next chapter may be written less by bombs than by what gets rebuilt first. Because in the end, the war was no longer only about missiles over water. It became a fight over roads beneath them, over steel and timing, over who could keep a fragile machine moving under the weight of fear and fire. And that is why one night of bridge strikes near Bandar Abbas may be remembered as more than a tactical operation. It may be remembered as the moment both sides stopped pretending this could stay a narrow conflict and started fighting for control of the system underneath it. When the first drivers reached those shattered crossings in the dark, they were not looking at the end of a road. They were looking at the start of a new phase of war, one where the deadliest target was no longer just the weapon, but the path that brought the weapon there.